they'll all have to grow, because I still believe that the policies of the last 50 years or 70 years, we are still financially repressed. I think there has been a great degree of growth in the financial sector in the last, I'd say, 5-10 years, but it needs to be far more, and that is because we still have very large part of the market which, though we have bank accounts, but that is not the ultimate measure of financial inclusion. People need more instruments. People should have access to insurance, pensions, better savings facilities, for which you also need more specialized institutions. And I think to that effect, the payment bank is a promising start. Now, while all of them that got the license obviously have not floated, many have gone under, but the ones that have subsisted and sustained, I do see great promise in those platforms getting further strengthened. I do think the insurance sector will pick up. Some of it has to do with the fact that the government is prioritizing, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that at this level of income, the demand for these kind of instruments is going to grow. And when that demand grows and people have the willingness to pay for these kind of instruments, and with the kind of state support that we are seeing, particularly in health, insurance is another sector which I think will pick up in a big way. Banking is another story. Banking really comes down to us having to think about not just the NPAs, etc., in the public sector banks, and how we're trying to resolve. It is a priority number one, I think, as far as the financial sector reforms are concerned. But within the private sector, the governance issues that have come up also need a scrutiny and resolution. The sentiment in the market has to pick up. Banking is fundamental to the growth of any economy, and we cannot let it stay in this state of morass. So in that effect, I think banking will be our immediate concern that needs resolution. Now, there is a lot of conversation, there's a lot of dialogue happening. There is a lot of movement as well. We've just seen the restructuring of the Bank Bureau Board. We have seen recapitalization happen in the past over the last 4 years, but obviously it isn't enough. I, for one, am a promoter I think we should allow some of the public sector banks to fail. I think we should go back to the original question of why does a country need public sector banks? How many public sector banks do we need? Inclusion is an agenda, should remain an agenda for a country like ours. There is always going to be a demand and room for public sector banks, but do we need so many clones of each other? I don't think so. I think we need a few large public sector banks with very specific differentiated models and sectors that they ought to be looking at. So that's where the conversations are happening. It'll take some time. When it's out, because that's the nature of policy. We don't have a definitive, unlike the budget announcements. Yes. When it comes to these kind of reforms and resolutions, I think these are work in progress till that big announcement happens. It depends on, so while I agree with Uday Kotak that private sector banks will compete, it depends on the time frame within which you are looking the performance of the banks. If you look at the last couple of years, then obviously the public sector banks are looking not as good. If you look at the last 20 years, perhaps you see that it isn't that different. And it has to do with the fact that essentially they cater to different needs of the economy. Almost all your Jan Dhan accounts were opened by public sector banks. Now, somebody should ask the private bankers, well, if inclusion is not an agenda, how do we move forward as a country on some of these things? So I think the Nayak committee recommendation is where we have to go back to. That fundamentally there is a governance problem. The way the directors are chosen, we need to get back into the basic governance structure of public sector banks. But beyond that governance, we also need to look at how many banks do we need, and they should not be clones of each other. They should really be, one should be for agriculture, one should be for whatever priority sector we try and define. And that will be in some sense an understanding of what are the priorities. Infrastructure could be one, but beyond that, we might also want to have a serious discussion on the priority sector lending itself, and whether the onus of that should rest on private sector banks as much, because I think the costs of priority sector lending really becomes it adds to the cost structure of the banking sector. So while it is a fundamental function of a public sector bank, the private sector bank views it as an added burden. Now, we might want to go back to that and think of, do we need it to the extent that we have? Can we tweak some of it to just allow for greater efficiency and growth within the private space, while looking at priority sector more as a differentiated banking for the public sector?